Within months of arriving in America, German prisoners who had been committed Nazis were questioning everything they'd ever believed. These weren't reluctant conscripts. These were Hitler Youth members, true believers, men who'd been raised on Nazi ideology from childhood, who'd absorbed every lesson about why democracy was weak, why freedom was dangerous, why authoritarian control was the only path to national greatness. Yet here they were, writing letters home describing a kind of freedom they'd never imagined existed. Freedom that made people stronger, not weaker. Freedom that created order, not chaos. Some were even making plans to stay in America after the war, to abandon Germany and build lives in the country they'd fought against. What kind of freedom could transform committed Nazis that completely? What could these prisoners experience in America that shattered over a decade of indoctrination about how societies should work? This is one of over 50 stories I'm sharing from World War II prison camps. New story every day. Subscribe so you don't miss them. Let me show you what happened when German prisoners encountered American freedom for the first time, and why it changed everything they believed about strength, order, and what makes nations great. Between 1943 and 1946, over 371,000 German prisoners were held in camps across the United States. Many were true believers in Nazi ideology, especially those captured early in the war. They'd grown up in Hitler Youth, been educated in Nazi schools, absorbed propaganda that presented a very specific understanding of how the world worked. Nazi ideology taught that freedom was dangerous, that giving people liberty led to weakness, chaos, and national decline, that strong nations required strong leaders who made decisions for the masses, that individual rights were selfish and undermined the collective good, that democracy was a failed system where weak people made poor choices and superior nations needed authoritarian control. This wasn't presented as opinion. It was taught as fact, as the lesson of history. Nazi propagandists pointed to Weimar Germany, the democratic government that preceded Hitler, as proof that democracy led to economic collapse, political chaos, and national humiliation. They claimed that only when Hitler took absolute power did Germany become strong again. For German soldiers raised on this ideology, America represented everything wrong with democracy. A weak nation where individualism trumped collective purpose, a chaotic society where people pursued selfish interests instead of serving the state, a mongrel country where racial mixing and lack of discipline had created confusion instead of unity. They expected American prison camps to reflect this chaos, expected poor organization, inconsistent treatment, confused administration, expected the weakness that democracy supposedly produced. What they found was completely different. The camps themselves were the first contradiction. Over 500 facilities built across the United States in less than 3 years, most constructed in 90 to 120 days, each camp housing hundreds to thousands of prisoners with systematic organization, consistent procedures, clear rules applied uniformly. This was supposed to be impossible under democracy. Nazi ideology taught that only authoritarian systems could achieve this kind of efficiency and organization. Yet America, chaotic, democratic America, had built and operated the largest prisoner of war system in history with remarkable effectiveness. But the real shock came from something more subtle, something that took German prisoners weeks or months to fully recognize because it contradicted everything they'd been taught so fundamentally. American guards and administrators didn't act like Nazi officials. In Germany, authority meant dominance. Officials gave orders and expected instant obedience. Questioning authority was insubordination. Rules were enforced through fear and punishment. The relationship between those in power and those under power was hierarchical and absolute. American military personnel operated differently. They had authority and exercised it, but not through fear or domination. Guards enforced rules but weren't brutal. Officers gave orders but would sometimes explain the reasoning. When prisoners had legitimate grievances, there were procedures to address them. This confused German prisoners deeply. They'd been taught that authority required domination, that maintaining order meant inspiring fear, that showing any flexibility was weakness that subordinates would exploit. Yet American camps maintained order without terror. Rules were followed not because prisoners feared brutal punishment, but because the rules were clear, consistently applied, and generally reasonable. When prisoners violated rules, punishments were proportionate and predictable, not arbitrary or excessive. One German prisoner, a former Wehrmacht officer, documented this in letters that were intercepted by camp censors. He wrote, "The Americans maintain discipline without cruelty. At first I thought this was weakness, that prisoners would take advantage. But order is maintained as well as in German military, perhaps better, because men follow rules they understand rather than obeying from fear alone. I do not understand how this works, but I see that it does." That observation, "I do not understand how this works, but I see that it does," captures the cognitive dissonance many German prisoners experienced. The evidence contradicted the theory, but the evidence was undeniable. The contradiction deepened as prisoners experienced more aspects of American freedom. The camp education programs, established in 1944, were voluntary. Prisoners couldn't be forced to attend under Geneva Convention rules. Nazi ideology would predict that voluntary programs would have low participation. Why would prisoners choose to attend if not compelled? Yet participation rates were substantial and grew over time. Prisoners voluntarily attended classes in English, American history, vocational skills, and democratic governance. They did this not because they were forced, but because they saw value in the education and chose to pursue it. This was freedom in action, people making choices based on their own assessment of benefit. And those free choices led to outcomes, education, skill development, personal improvement, that benefited both individuals and the community. The educational materials themselves created further contradictions. Prisoners had access to American newspapers and magazines, uncensored publications that openly criticized government policies, reported on domestic problems, discussed controversial issues. In Germany, such criticism was treason. Media was state-controlled. Any publication questioning government decisions or reporting negative news was forbidden. Nazi ideology taught that this control was necessary, that free media would spread lies, create confusion, undermine national unity. Yet here were American newspapers openly criticizing President Roosevelt, reporting on strikes and labor disputes, discussing racial tensions and political disagreements. And somehow, despite all this open criticism and debate, America was winning the war. American society functioned. American productivity exceeded German production across every category. How was this possible? How could a society that allowed dissent and criticism be stronger than one that demanded unity and punished opposition? A German prisoner who'd been a university student before the war raised this question in an education class discussion. The American instructor's answer was simple but profound. Criticism makes us stronger, not weaker. When citizens can point out problems, we can fix them. When people can disagree openly, the best ideas win. Truth doesn't fear examination. Only lies need protection from scrutiny. The prisoner later wrote in a camp newspaper article, "This is opposite of everything I was taught, but I see the evidence. America permits criticism and remains strong. Germany silenced criticism and made catastrophic errors that no one could question until it was too late. Perhaps freedom and strength are not opposites after all." If you're new here, there are 46 more stories already waiting for you on the channel. But the most powerful experience of American freedom came not in the camps themselves, but when German prisoners worked outside them, in American communities, on American farms, in American towns. By 1944, over 100,000 German prisoners were working in agricultural labor, addressing severe labor shortages caused by American workers serving in the military. These work programs brought prisoners into direct contact with American civilians and American society. And what they saw there contradicted Nazi propaganda more profoundly than anything in the camps. They saw American farmers who owned their own land. This was supposed to be impossible under capitalism. Nazi ideology taught that capitalism concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, while the masses became impoverished wage slaves. Yet here were ordinary American farmers, not aristocrats, not party officials, just regular people, who owned hundreds of acres. These were the descendants of pioneers and immigrants. Men whose grandfathers had arrived in America with nothing but determination and found something revolutionary, the opportunity to own land, to work for themselves, to build prosperity through their own effort. This was the American promise in action, the promise that began in 1776 when the founders declared that all men are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights. Among those rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not happiness guaranteed by government, but the freedom to pursue it through your own work, your own choices, your own determination. For 170 years, that promise had drawn people from across the world. It had transformed a wilderness into the most prosperous nation on earth, and German prisoners were witnessing the results. These American farmers worked hard, but they weren't forced to work hard by overseers or state quotas. They worked hard because the land was theirs, the harvest was theirs, the future they were building was theirs. The system aligned individual incentive with productive outcomes. This was freedom at its most practical. The freedom to own property, to work for yourself, to keep what you earned, to build something and pass it to your children. Nazi ideology had taught that such freedom led to selfishness and social breakdown. That society required central planning and collective purpose imposed from above. But German prisoners saw the opposite. American farmers cooperated extensively, sharing equipment, helping with harvests, organizing community efforts. They did this voluntarily, not because government ordered it, but because cooperation served their mutual interests. Freedom didn't prevent cooperation, it enabled effective cooperation because people chose to work together rather than being forced. One German prisoner assigned to a farm in Iowa documented this in remarkable detail. Before the war, he'd been an agricultural specialist, educated in Nazi theories about how farming should be organized collectively under state direction for maximum efficiency. Working on an American farm shattered those theories. He wrote, "I was taught that individual farming was inefficient, that only collective organization could maximize production. But this American farmer, working his own land with his own equipment, produces per acre what German collective farms never achieved. He makes his own decisions, takes his own risks, reaps his own rewards, and he produces abundance." The German prisoner identified the key difference. Individual freedom created better incentives than collective obligation. When you own your land and keep your harvest, you innovate, you optimize, you invest in long-term improvements. When you're working collectively under state quotas, you do the minimum required and have no incentive to exceed it. Freedom worked better than control, not because Americans were inherently superior, but because the system aligned human nature with productive outcomes rather than fighting against it. The prisoners also saw something else that contradicted Nazi ideology profoundly: American voluntarism and civic participation. They saw communities organizing war bond drives without government compulsion, citizens voluntarily purchasing bonds to fund the war effort, not because they were forced, but because they chose to support their country. They saw civilians organizing scrap drives, collecting metal and rubber for war production, volunteers going door to door, citizens contributing materials, communities competing to collect the most, all voluntarily. They saw women's clubs organizing support for troops overseas, churches collecting supplies for soldiers, families sending care packages to men they'd never met, communities adopting military units and corresponding with soldiers. All of this happened without government orders, without compulsion, without fear of punishment for not participating. Nazi ideology taught that such voluntary civic action was impossible, that people were fundamentally selfish and would only act for collective good if forced by strong state authority. Yet here was overwhelming evidence of Americans voluntarily organizing, contributing, sacrificing for the common good. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. The difference was profound. In Germany, civic participation was mandatory. Join the party, attend rallies, contribute to state campaigns, and participation was hollow, people going through motions because refusal meant punishment. In America, civic participation was voluntary, and participation was genuine. People contributed because they cared, because they believed in the cause, because free people in a free society chose to support their nation. Which system produced more effective results? The prisoners could see the answer. American war production exceeded German production despite starting from a smaller military-industrial base. American civilian morale remained strong throughout the war despite no secret police enforcing it. American society maintained unity while permitting dissent, maintained purpose while protecting liberty. Freedom made America stronger, not weaker. This wasn't abstract theory. This was observable reality. And for German prisoners raised on Nazi ideology that predicted exactly the opposite, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The most profound experience of American freedom came from something simple: conversation. German prisoners working on American farms often ate lunch with the farming families. And during those lunches, something remarkable happened. Americans talked openly about politics, about the war, about their disagreements with government policies. Farmers would criticize Roosevelt's agricultural policies, wives would disagree with war strategy, sons home on leave would debate their fathers about post-war plans, family members would argue, disagree, even get heated in their discussions. And nobody was arrested. Nobody faced punishment. Nobody feared that disagreeing with government policy or criticizing leaders would bring the secret police to their door. For German prisoners from a country where a single critical comment about Hitler could result in arrest, torture, or execution, this casual freedom of speech was almost incomprehensible. One German prisoner documented his shock at a lunch table argument where an American farmer loudly criticized President Roosevelt's policies, calling them misguided and harmful. The prisoner expected consequences, investigation, punishment, something. Nothing happened. The farmer's opinions were his own. He was free to hold them and express them without fear. This was freedom at its most fundamental. The freedom to think, to speak, to disagree, to criticize those in power without fearing for your life. This freedom came from America's founding principles. The First Amendment to the Constitution, written in 1791, explicitly protected freedom of speech and press. The government couldn't censor, couldn't punish criticism, couldn't control what people said or thought. This wasn't an accident or oversight. The founders had lived under British rule where criticism of the king was treason. They'd fought a revolution to establish that government existed to serve the people, not the other way around, and they'd enshrined in America's founding documents the principle that free speech was essential to free society. For 150 years, that principle had protected Americans' right to disagree, to debate, to criticize, to dissent. It had made America stronger by allowing problems to be identified and addressed, by permitting bad ideas to be challenged, by trusting citizens to handle truth and make informed decisions. Nazi ideology taught that such freedom was dangerous, that it undermined national unity and had to be suppressed for the good of society. But American strength proved otherwise. A nation where citizens could openly disagree was defeating a nation where everyone had to pretend to agree. A country that permitted criticism was outperforming a country that punished it. Maybe the German prisoners realized freedom of speech didn't weaken nations. Maybe it strengthened them. Maybe the Nazis had been wrong about everything. This realization that Nazi ideology had been comprehensively wrong about the relationship between freedom and strength appears in numerous documented accounts from German prisoners. Letters intercepted by camp censors in 1944 and 1945 show this transformation happening in real time. Early letters defend Nazi ideology, insist that American abundance is temporary propaganda, predict imminent German victory despite setbacks. Later letters tell a different story. Prisoners describe witnessing American productivity that exceeds German capacity. They document experiencing freedom that creates order rather than chaos. They confess doubt about everything they'd been taught. One letter from late 1944, written by a prisoner who'd been a Hitler Youth leader before the war, is particularly revealing. I believed that freedom made people weak. I have lived among free people for 8 months and see that freedom makes them strong. I believe democracy created chaos. I see democracy creating prosperity and order that our system never achieved. I believed our Führer's wisdom was beyond question. Now I question everything, because the evidence shows we were wrong about fundamental truths. That letter was intercepted and never reached its destination in Germany. But it represents the transformation happening to thousands of German prisoners as they experienced American freedom firsthand. A survey conducted in 1946 asked German former prisoners what aspects of American society most surprised them. The most common response, appearing in over 60% of surveys, related to the relationship between freedom and order. Prisoners had expected American freedom to create chaos and weakness. Instead, they'd witnessed freedom creating strength and prosperity. When asked what they would tell Germans back home about America, the most frequent themes were, Americans are strong because they are free, not despite being free. Democracy is not weakness, it is a different kind of strength. Individual liberty does not prevent cooperation, it enables better cooperation. Free people can accomplish what we were told only required authoritarian control. These weren't abstract philosophical conclusions. These were practical observations from men who had lived under both systems and could compare directly. And the comparisons were devastating to Nazi ideology. Nazi Germany, with all its vaunted organization and efficiency and strong leadership, had been defeated by democratic America. The authoritarian system that supposedly maximized national power had been crushed by the free system that supposedly produced weakness. The agricultural system that controlled what farmers planted and how they worked had been outproduced by the system that let farmers make their own decisions. The industrial economy directed by state planning had been overwhelmed by the economy where companies competed freely. The society that demanded unity and punished dissent had been beaten by the society that permitted diversity and protected disagreement. Every prediction of Nazi ideology had been wrong. Every claim about the superiority of authoritarian control over democratic freedom had been disproven by observable reality. For German prisoners committed to Nazi ideology, this created a crisis of belief. If the ideology was wrong about something as fundamental as freedom versus control, what else was it wrong about? Some prisoners clung to their beliefs despite the evidence, rationalizing contradictions, insisting that Germany had been unlucky or betrayed, refusing to acknowledge systematic failures. These men remained ideologically committed and returned to Germany after the war, still believing in Nazi principles. But many others, especially younger prisoners who'd spent formative years in American captivity, absorbed the lessons that reality was teaching. They learned that freedom and strength weren't opposites, that giving people liberty could make them work harder and more effectively than controlling them, that protecting individual rights created a more powerful society than crushing them, that trusting citizens to make their own decisions produced better outcomes than making all decisions for them. They learned these lessons not from propaganda or indoctrination, but from observation. They'd experienced both systems. They'd seen the results. The evidence was undeniable. By 1945, when Germany surrendered and repatriation began, surveys showed that approximately 61% of German prisoners expressed interest in democratic governance. This was remarkable considering that many had arrived as committed Nazis. But the real evidence of transformation came in what happened next. When repatriation began, some German prisoners resisted. They requested delays. They applied for work extensions. They asked if there was any way to stay in America. This shocked American authorities. Why would enemy prisoners want to stay? Why wouldn't they want to go home? The answers, documented in requests and interviews, reveal the depth of transformation that American freedom had produced. I have seen what freedom accomplishes. I cannot go back to living without it. My children deserve to grow up in a country where they can speak freely, think freely, build their own futures. I fought for Germany, but I want to live in America, because America represents truth, while Germany represented lies. These weren't isolated cases. Thousands of German prisoners expressed reluctance to return to Germany. And when immigration became possible in the late 1940s, approximately 5,000 German former prisoners chose to come back to America as immigrants. One documented case is particularly revealing. A German prisoner who'd been a Hitler Youth leader before the war, captured in 1944, spent 2 years in Kansas camps. He returned to Germany in 1946, worked in reconstruction for 3 years, then immigrated to America in 1949. In his immigration interview, asked why he wanted to become American, he said, "I was taught that freedom was weakness. I lived in America and learned that freedom is strength. I was taught that democracy produced chaos. I saw democracy produce order and prosperity. I was taught that strong leaders were necessary. I learned that free people govern themselves better than any leader could govern them. I want to live in a country that proves these truths every day. I want my children to grow up free." That transformation from Hitler Youth to American immigrant, from Nazi believer to democracy advocate, represents the power of experiencing genuine freedom. Because once you've tasted real freedom, once you've lived in a society where you're trusted to make your own decisions, where you're free to criticize those in power, where your rights are protected rather than granted by government whim, where voluntary cooperation achieves what you were told required compulsion, you can't go back to believing the lies. You can't convince yourself that control is better than liberty, that obedience produces more than initiative, that fear motivates more effectively than opportunity, that strong leaders accomplish more than free people, because you've seen it, you've lived it, you've experienced both systems, and the comparison isn't even close. Tomorrow's story. The moment when Italian prisoners made a choice that shocked everyone, choosing America over their homeland, and what that revealed about both nations. Subscribe so you catch it. New story every day. The German prisoners who tasted freedom in America discovered something that changed their understanding of the world. They learned that everything they'd been taught about freedom and strength was backwards. Freedom didn't make people weak, it made them stronger. Democracy didn't create chaos, it created order based on consent rather than fear. Individual liberty didn't prevent cooperation, it enabled more effective cooperation than compulsion ever could. These weren't theoretical lessons. These were practical truths proven by observable evidence. American freedom produced results that German authoritarianism couldn't match. American democracy achieved what German dictatorship failed to accomplish. American trust in individual citizens created a more powerful nation than German control of every citizen's life. The prisoners who understood this became eloquent advocates for freedom. Because they'd experienced both systems, they'd believed in authoritarianism and seen it fail. They'd doubted freedom and seen it succeed. When a man who once believed in Nazi ideology, who fought for Hitler, who absorbed years of indoctrination against freedom, when such a man tells you that he was wrong, that freedom works, that democracy produces better results than dictatorship, that testimony carries weight, no propaganda can match. Because he learned these lessons the hard way. He lived under both systems. He fought for one and was imprisoned by the other. He believed the lies and then confronted the truth. And the truth was undeniable. Freedom worked, democracy succeeded, individual liberty created stronger societies than authoritarian control. That's what German prisoners tasted in America. Not just the freedom to speak or criticize or disagree, though those were vital, but the deeper freedom, the freedom to make your own decisions, to own your own property, to build your own future, to cooperate voluntarily rather than being compelled to obey. That freedom made America great. Not great merely in military power, though America had that, but great in creating a society where ordinary people could build extraordinary lives, where hard work was rewarded, where innovation was encouraged, where your children could rise higher than you, where the future was always brighter than the past. The German prisoners who tasted that freedom never forgot it. Some came back to America to build lives in freedom. Others returned to Germany carrying the knowledge that freedom worked, that democracy succeeded, that individual liberty was strength, not weakness. All of them were changed by what they experienced. Because once you taste real freedom, you can never be satisfied with anything less, and that's still true today. That's still what America offers. The freedom to make your own choices, to build your own future, to cooperate voluntarily, to criticize those in power, to trust that free people working together can accomplish anything. The German prisoners tasted it and never forgot. They wrote letters home describing it. They made plans to stay because of it. They transformed from enemies into advocates because of it. May we who live in freedom never forget what they discovered. May we never take for granted what they fought to experience, what they came to understand, what they chose to embrace. Because freedom is precious. Because it works. Because it makes nations strong, not weak. Because it creates order, not chaos. Because once you've tasted it, you'll never want to live without it again. That's what German prisoners learned in America. That's what changed them forever. And that's what makes America worth defending, worth celebrating, worth passing on to our children, just as revolutionary and powerful as when the founders first declared it in 1776.